Well, hello everyone. This is Pastor Searle back at you with another Wednesday watch party video, and I get to talk to you about science, which is always a fun thing. So, the topic for this evening is it scientifically plausible to have a global flood? I mean, is it possible that the entire Earth could be covered with water? I mean, is this even a reasonable thing to consider? You have to ask questions like, well, if the Earth was completely underwater, where did all the water go? Well, it's fairly obvious that 71% of the Earth's surface is still underwater. There's a whole lot of ocean out there. And so the water didn't go anywhere. It's still here. It's just rearranged a little bit. So if the water didn't have to go anywhere, then you have to ask, well, where did it come from? And it is true that it is impossible. It is completely impossible for rainfall to account for the oceans. If that much water fell, the gravitational potential energy released into kinetic energy turned into thermal energy would have boiled the oceans. It's impossible to have that much water fall from the sky. Well, according to the Bible, there was a second source for the water, and in fact, it's probably the larger source of the water. So we have the windows of heaven, rain falling, but we also have the fountains of the deep opening up. And these were completely unknown to science until, believe it or not, 1977. So just very, very recent history, in the last 40 years or so, the fountains of the great deep have been photographed and seen, and we have these huge underwater fountains that are still throwing water into the bottoms of the oceans even today. So there's plenty of water out there, and there's plenty of water underground to source the oceans and all the water that we have. Well, the next question is obviously, well, how could a global flood have covered things like Mount Everest? Mount Everest is 29,000 feet and change tall above sea level. That's a lot of water. Well, the simple answer is Mount Everest wasn't that tall at the time. In fact, if you look at the depth of the oceans, the Challenger Deep has a spot that is 36,000 feet below sea level. You could take Mount Everest and throw it in the bottom of the Mariana Trench and try to fill in the Challenger Deep, and you would still have a hole left over. So there's a lot of water out there. And in fact, if you took all of the dirt, all the continents, and smoothed them out and made a round ball, you would have an ocean over 2 miles deep. So as we look at the globe again, the thickness or depth of the ocean is the thickness of the paper on the globe. For scale, all of the water in the oceans today is the thickness of the paper on the globe. Just to understand how much dirt there is out there versus how much water. So as we look at this again, Noah and his family were on the ark for 371 days. That's over a year for those of you who are math challenged. And all of the mountains rose up at the end of the flood and the oceans sank down. So water sank into some low spots where the crust was a little thinner, a little lighter. It popped up. And so we have these large changes in the altitude of the dirt or the depth of the ocean. And so we just have to understand that we don't have lily pads of dirt making up continents. There's dirt all the way down to the center of the earth. It's just that there's water in a few puddle spots that happen to be 71% of the surface. So if there were a global flood, what kinds of evidence would we expect to see? Well, we'd expect to see a whole lot of sedimentary rock, or rock laid down by water. So what do we see? 85% of the Earth's surface is sedimentary rock. 85%. There's a little bit of igneous and volcanic rock in there, but it's a smaller percentage. We would also expect to see different angles in the sands. When sand is laid down by water, it has a different angle of repose than if it's laid down by, say, air movements. And so you can tell in a sedimentary rock whether it got there by water movement or air movement. It's fairly easy to see. You would also expect to see that rock does not bend. Rocks are not known for being plastic and formable unless they're wet and pliable in a mud form. Concrete is a good example. It is nice and pliable until it sets. Same thing with sedimentary rock. As we look at the rock layers that we see all over the planet, they often bend and formed and have contours to them, and there are smooth surfaces and angles to them. They're not crumbled and cracked, and they've not been exposed to a lot of heat and metamorphized, which is a completely different kind of rock than the sedimentary rock that we often see miles and miles deep. We would also expect to see that the sand layers or rock layers that are formed on various continents would flow over onto the adjacent continents, especially if current theories hold, the Pangea or one of the other models, with a single continent breaking up to become the continents we see today. You would expect to see rock layers on multiple continents that are connected and similar. And in fact, we see that. The White Cliffs of Dover have correspondent rock formations on coastal Europe. There are sand formations in Europe that continue across into North America. There are sand formations that cover all of North America, and all of these things show that there was a lot of water moving a whole lot to move all that rock around to form all these sedimentary layers. Now, we also do not see erosion layers or erosion marks in between the layers. That would indicate that the layers formed at fairly pretty much just about, well, at the same time. They formed very quickly and did not have time allowed in between to erode those layers and leave river marks and so forth. If there were millions and millions of years between layers, you would expect to see lots of erosion and lots of wear marks from weather. And that's something we do not see. There are also fossils that bridge in between layers. And so you'll have tree stumps that go through millions and millions of years of layers by the secular models, which makes absolutely no sense. But in a flood model, where it's a very quick deposition of layers and a fairly quick hardening of the dirt back into rock, this makes perfect sense. Most fossils in all of the layers are marine fossils. 95% of the fossils found are marine critters. And those marine critters are found in all of the layers, whether they're terrestrial dinosaurs or pterosaurs or other marine critters or forests or whatnot. There are marine animals in all of the layers, which makes perfect sense in a global flood. If there were a global flood, you would also expect to see tsunami-like waves doing hydraulic sorting by density. And this is exactly what we see in many of the fossil beds found across North America and elsewhere, where the animals died and were sorted by density of bones, as well as where their habitat was. And all of this is perfect evidence to show a global flood. Now, it is good to remember that without the continents in the way, the tidal forces would create waves over 200 feet high. 200-foot high wave action would do an awesome job of sorting dead critters and floating forests and all of that sort of thing into the densified layers that we see today. There are also no transition fossils ever found. And if evolution were true, then we'd expect to see more transition fossils than the fossils that we see of the individual animals that show up, completely perfect and fully formed, fully complex from the very beginning of finding them. Life appears suddenly and in its complete complexity from the very beginning. Now, if you think that fossil layers are not found on top of mountains, you would be incorrect. There are fossil clams on top of Mount Everest where both the upper and lower clamshell are still together, meaning that the clam died suddenly and didn't have time to relax its closing muscles and allow those two shell halves to fall away from each other. Now, these clams are 5 to 6 feet in diameter in many cases on the top of Mount Everest. They probably didn't climb there, so it's clear that that mountain was at one time underwater. Another example is Pikes Peak in Colorado, where if you go to the back side of the parking lot, away from the visitor center, away from the gift shop, you can find fossilized marine critters in the rock that was scraped off to make the parking lot. These are not the only examples. These are just a few examples. Other examples include the Channel Scablands in central Washington, the evidence for Lake Missoula and Lake Bonneville, where large bodies of water formed after the flood and were allowed to run off through various erosion channels, leaving their mark. And if there were a global flood, you would also expect to see a global ice age afterwards. hot oceans lead to increased snowfall. Increased snowfall on rapidly rising continental plates would create the perfect conditions for ice flows, ice sheets, and that sort of thing, lasting hundreds of years. And in fact, this is exactly what we see as we look at the geological formations across all of the continents. Other examples of things you might expect to see would be oscillating magnetic field as the continents move around to their now current positions from where they were before. You would expect the magnetic poles to move around in various random fashions until that is done. And that's exactly what we see in the magnetic fields stored in the various rocks as they cooled and hardened, accepting whatever the magnetic field was at the time when they were cooling. So suffice to say, the Bible is spot on with what it tells us to expect to see. We can look at the science, we can see the evidence, and we need to make a choice. Do we believe the secular models, or do we go with the biblical model? And the biblical model, by far, matches the evidence much better and in much greater detail. Now, obviously, in a 10 to 12 minute video, we can't give all of the evidence. You could grab additional resources like Answers in Genesis has a little booklet here entitled Global Flood. They have a whole lot more information, and you can always contact us on the website or through email, and we'd be happy to answer your questions about this or any other topic. So until the next watch party, have fun, enjoy, and we'll see you again soon.